Hello, I'm Tamara and I teach beginner sewing tutorials. Today we are going to be learning how to make these large hot pads and this extra large hot pad. They're nice and thick and they will be able to withstand heat because we are going to be using some insole fleece along with some batting. Now all of these hot pads have been made using the scraps from last week's sewing tutorial, which was this casserole carrying dish. Now, if you did not make this tutorial and you don't want to, you just want to make the extra large hot pads, that is okay. I have added all of the measurements that you will need for these larger hot pads as well, and I explain both ways of making them as we go through the process. So let's jump on in to making the large hot pads first, and then I will walk you through making that extra large hot pad.
So I will be using all 8 scrap fabrics from my casserole carrying dish tutorial. And of course, if you don't want to make that tutorial and you just want to make the hot pads, I will give you all the measurements that you need to be able to just make these hot pads. But if you are using the scraps, I want you to know that you will be able to get 2 of my large hot pads out of it and then 1 of my extra large hot pads out of it. They are all larger hot pads than your average hot pad, and that's because I think it is a helpful thing to have a hot pad that fits underneath your entire casserole dish. So let's start by making the large hot pad. That is actually the smaller hot pad of the 2. You will grab 1 of the fabrics that is quilted to the insole fleece, and you will grab 1 of the fabrics that is attached to the regular batting. Now, all of these scraps are cut at 11 inches by 12 inches, but for the large hot pad, you need your panels to be cut at 11 inches by 11 inches. So for myself, I'm going to trim it in a way that my quilting is neatly centered, but you can trim it however you want. Just make sure that your panels are square. Then cut a piece of batting that is also the same size as the square panels you just cut. So my batting will also be cut at 11 inches by 11 inches. I like to have 3 layers in my hot pads. So I'll have 2 layers of batting, 1 layer of insole fleece, and then of course the 2 cotton layers on top of that. Because you are sewing through so many thick layers, I highly recommend that you use a walking foot when you are sewing this project together. I used my walking foot for the entire project. So I'm going to take my second layer of batting and quilt it to my panel that already has the batting quilted to the cotton. I'm just going to add a few more quilt lines. It doesn't have to be a lot, but just enough to hold these layers together. I also like to do this using a top stitch length of 3 millimeters instead of your regular sewing stitch length of 2.5 millimeters. I find it just gives a nicer look, and you're sewing through so many thick layers, it allows your needle and your sewing foot to move the fabric through a little bit nicer. Now my green panel has the 2 batting layers quilted to it, so I'm going to lay it right sides together with my panel that has the insole fleece on the back. Then pin around the entire project, and you want to leave about a 5-inch opening on one of the sides. I like to mark that with different pins to remind me when I'm sewing not to sew across that section. And take it to your sewing machine and sew a 1/2-inch seam allowance, starting and stopping with a back stitch around the entire project, excluding that 5-inch opening. Do this with your normal stitch length. For myself, that's a 2.5 millimeter stitch length. Then trim away all 4 corners of their excess batting, making sure, of course, not to snip into your sewn seam allowance. And I also will go along all 3 edges and trim away all that excess batting as well. Don't trim away the excess batting from the open edge, however. It will make it harder to fold those edges in later on. Then we can turn our project right side out and just push those points out gently with your finger. I find using a pointy object like my chopsticks just didn't work because I was working with too much thick fabric. So just gently push those points out with your finger and that will be good enough. Then take it to your iron and with a low heat setting, press all of those edges nice and flat. And of course, along that open edge, press those flaps in. pin along that edge, and then we are going to take this back to our sewing machine, sewing a 1/4 inch seam allowance around the entire project, starting and stopping with a back stitch. And what I highly recommend, because you're sewing through that thick fabric, you're keeping your walking foot on your sewing machine, and you are lengthening your stitch length once again to that 3mm stitch length. It's more of a top stitch look, but it also allows your needle and fabric to move through the sewing machine a lot easier. You can stop at this point, but I think adding one more top stitch will just level up your hot pad's look. So I marked a square in the center of my hot pad, and then I followed that square all the way around, sewing that second top stitch, again with that 3mm length, starting and stopping with a back stitch. For this one in particular, I did not measure a full 2 inches in because I actually lined up 2 of my sides with some of my quilting lines because I thought it would look a little bit tidier. But if your quilting lines are different, maybe you just did an X in the center, then just measure in 2 inches, and then that'll make it easy to draw your square in the center. And that is how easy it is to make a nice, simple square hot pad. It's nice and thick, so it's going to withstand some heat, which is something you definitely want. And if you are working with the scraps from our previous project, then you can actually make 2 of these large hot pads before moving on to making 1 of our extra large hot pad.
And that's how you make the large hot pads. Now let's move on to making the extra large hot pads. And of course, if you are enjoying this tutorial, please hit that thumbs up button and subscribe for more beginner sewing tutorials. All right, let's jump on in.
You will end up needing 4 of your scrap panels from the previous project. So these panels, like I said before, are cut at 11 inches by 12 inches. You are going to line up the 12-inch edge and pin across that, and then sew a 1-inch seam allowance down that edge, creating 2 large panels. Now, if you're not using scraps, all you need to do is make your panels at 12 inches high by 16 inches wide. And then you just need 2 panels instead of the 4 to create the 2 panels. Now you can of course skip this piecing together step if you're just cutting your 12-inch by 16-inch panels, but if you are piecing together, then once you've sewn that 1-inch seam to piece it together, take your iron on a low heat setting and press open those sewn seams. Then pin those flaps open, take it back to your sewing machine and sew a top stitch along both sides of that center seam. Do this with a top stitch of 3mm. It's just a little bit of a longer stitch length. It just looks a little nicer, that's all. And then, since these panels are a little bit long, you're going to take the section of the fabric that just has the batting on the back, not the section with the insole fleece on the back. And you are going to trim away the excess from that side. So for myself, it's this green fabric here that just has batting on the back. The pink has the insole fleece. I'm going to measure 16 inches across and then trim away the excess. So now I will have a panel at 12 inches by 16 inches. Do this for both panels. Then cut another piece of batting at 12 inches by 16 inches and quilt it to the back of one of these panels. Quilt it however you want. For myself, I'm just going to pin my layers together and I'm going to sew a few straight seams across, again using a top stitch just to give it a nicer look. So that's extending that stitch length just a little bit. Now that the 2 panels are prepared, you need to lay them right sides together. But if you pieced sections together, you will notice you do not have insole fleece going across the entire backing. So make sure when you are laying your pieces right sides together that you are laying them swapped. That way you will end up with insole fleece across the entire backing. Then pin your panels together, once again, marking a section about 5 inches wide where you will not sew across. You will sew a 1/2 inch seam allowance around your entire project, starting and stopping with a back stitch, and of course not sewing across that 5-inch opening. Once your 2 panels have been sewn together, then we will trim away our corners, trimming away any excess batting as well, except for the side where we have that opening. You do need a little bit of that excess fabric left behind there. But for the rest of the edges, trim away all of that excess bulk. Then turn your project right side out, and once again with your hand just gently push out those points before taking it to your iron and on a low heat setting, pressing those edges flat and clipping across that opening. Then take it back to your sewing machine and sew a 1/4 inch seam allowance around the entire edge, starting and stopping with a back stitch, and once again extending that stitch length to a nice top stitch length of 3 millimeters. And then I also added an extra rectangle in the center, also using a top stitch, just securing all of the layers together and giving it a nice finished look.
And that, my friends, is how you can easily make a large or an extra large hot pad. I hope you enjoyed this sewing tutorial, and I will see you next time. Bye for now.